Animal Rights Academy is a free lecture series based in Toronto, Canada. On November 24th, 2015, Paul Jenkins brought to the Academy a presentation called Towards a Freegan Lifestyle, Veganism and the End of Money. Paul is a freelance musician based in Toronto's Cabbagetown, an Animal Rights Academy alumni and enabler. Last year, he sat on a panel reacting to Extra's meat issue. A 12-year-old Paul liberated a bin full of discarded end-of-day baking, and his fascination with Freeganism was born. In this message, Paul gives an overview of Freeganism and its roots in anarchy. What might the world be like without money? You're about to find out.
Well, thanks for having me tonight. I'd like to talk a little bit about a subject that's interested me for many years. It's actually an intersection of subjects. Veganism, Freeganism, and money. And each of these could be, there are endless paths that one could follow when looking at these subjects and how they interrelate. So I'm going to have to just touch on things briefly and look at some historical examples of people who have thought about our relationship with money and exchange and our dietary and consumption practices, and how the future looks for us, potentially, in different scenarios. And I found this quote from J.M. Coetzee, which really spoke to me about how we relate to the world around us. As vegans, we have a certain amount of alienation from mainstream culture because we see carnage consumption everywhere all the time, and it's such a part of mainstream society that it seems to be in its own kind of banal way normal, and yet we see it as madness. And this quote, I'll just give you a few seconds just to get the sense of it. So not just meat and meat products and animal products that have been bought and sold, but the image of the pound of flesh, as it were, that are the sweat of our labor, and all kinds of invisible violence that happens between the production and the consumption of goods and services, in a modern society at least. This image is called the logic of neoliberalism. You can see little computer tablets that with faces on them, they look like the old-fashioned Apple logo face, on wheels, going round and round, with little fenced-in gardens and devastation around, and the sort of destroying gaze of the bar-coded automaton with his knife and fork, which almost look like shovels. Devastation everywhere and pollution. So it brought to mind a quote from John McMurtry, which appears on the Zeitgeist Movement Defined, which is a book that delineates the ideas behind a natural law resource-based economy. A huge topic in itself. It's a whole book, a very dense book, collaboratively written. John McMurtry appeared at U of T last year at the Global Zeitgeist Day event, which was in the Medical Sciences building, and he gave a very long, impassioned speech. This quote summarizes his view of global corporate culture. The air, the soil, the water cumulatively degrade. The climates and oceans destabilize. Species become extinct at a spasm rate across continents. Pollution cycles and volumes increase to endanger life systems at all levels in cascade effects. A rising half of the world is destitute as inequality multiplies. The global food system produces more and more disabling and contaminated junk food without nutritional value. Non-contagious diseases multiply to the world's biggest killers with only symptom cures. The vocational future of the next generation collapses across the world while the bank debts rise. The global financial system has ceased to function for productive investment in life goods. Collective interest agencies of governments and unions are stripped, while for-profit state subsidies multiply. Police state laws and methods advance while belligerent wars for corporate resources increase. The media and corporate ad vehicles and the academy are increasingly reduced to corporate functions. Public sectors and services are non-stop defunded and privatized as tax evasion and transnational corporate funding and service by governments rise at the same time at every level. He's not optimistic, and he's one of the spokesmen of the Zeitgeist movement. So when we think of consumption, many things come to mind, and this little chain makes it look really quite nice and convenient. And of course, convenience is one of the hallmarks of consumption. You know, if we had to actually do the hard work of simply brushing our teeth, without products. You would find that there are all kinds of skills we'd have to learn about how to harvest the right kind of plant and use the right kind of material. And then we come into the subject of healthcare, and at what level of our lives have we been medicalized to the point where we're very dependent on this system. Collaborative consumption is a more recent phenomenon. It has a lot to do with our connected technology and the idea of using apps on our phones to source goods and services. It's been called the sharing economy, although I think it's been misappropriated. If you look at groups like Airbnb and Uber and things that are actually giant corporations that seem to want to call themselves part of the sharing economy. There's an article from Jacobin magazine which talks about how seductive this is, because here we have the perfect matchmaker between Silicon Valley with apps that pair workers with work. So if you want an apartment with Airbnb, or a cab through Uber, or have your house cleaned through HomeJoy, under the guise of innovation and progress, companies are actually stripping away worker protections, pushing down wages, and flouting government regulations. At its core, the sharing economy is a scheme to shift risk from companies to workers, discourage labor organizing, and ensure that capitalists can reap huge profits with low overheads. There's nothing new or innovative about this business model. Uber is just capitalism in its most naked form. In the Toronto example, you could say, well, not entirely, because the cab industry was exposed as being quite corrupt when this Uber issue became a news item. However, the sharing economy in other terms is actually a very beneficial thing. If you look at the Toronto Tool Library, for instance, it's a way to access equipment for next to nothing. I mean, it does still function in a monetary society, and it has costs to cover, but the costs can be covered through volunteer labor, through donation of tools. It's really a much truer example of sharing economy. It's more robust. It doesn't depend on apps and technology, and there's no corporation involved. It's a board of directors, a non-profit organization. And we'll talk a little more about that later. Ethical consumption became an issue in the 1980s as people started to wonder about really the hidden aspects of production and where their money is going. So there are all kinds of categories in terms of ethical consumption that are investigated, and there's actually a whole industry called ethical procurement. And I was listening to a podcast this afternoon about a vegan anarchist who, in his day-to-day life, is an ethical procurement officer for companies. He investigates the supply chain to decide what is fairly, what they will tolerate. And it is a gray area. I mean, how bad are you willing to get before you say no to products, goods and services? So some of the categories are animal rights, human rights, pollution and toxics, corporate governance, nuclear power, climate change, supply chain resources, armaments, factory farming, animal testing, genetic engineering. All kinds of organizations are set up to monitor these things. However, you get into areas that are supposedly ethical. The idea of dolphin safe, that you can buy fish that's free of dolphins, or that your beef is grass-fed, that is somehow ethical, or that your food is halal, produced halal or kosher. And we've had discussions here about how halal and kosher food has to be redefined if it's going to be ethical, because there's all kinds of cruelty that's tolerated under those systems. Rosa Luxemburg, who was a Marxist theorist, talking about reformism or welfarism in regard to animal safety, although she didn't address it directly, went so far as to say that capitalism itself is not overthrown, but on the contrary is actually strengthened by the development of these reforms, these ethical reforms, because it makes the unconscionable less intolerable through tiny increments. A brief history of consumption. And I like this image because it takes an image of somebody putting trash in its proper place, which is throwing it in the bin, and somebody actually taking it out of the bin. And it makes us think about what are our wants as opposed to our needs. This image of consumption, it's kind of blurry, and I actually couldn't read all the ingredients of the shit. The ecosystems are the food of the consumption machine. It did bring to mind, though, that one of the almost universal features of modern society is our habit of shitting in our drinking water, which is something that many Freegans would frown on and would go really to a lot of trouble to make this not happen, to actually disconnect their plumbing, their toilet, and to make this wasted resource a useful resource, human manure. In fact, a distant relative of mine by the name of Joseph Jenkins wrote a manual called the Human Manure Handbook about how we can all make huge strides in our carbon footprint simply by diverting our own personal waste. Next, interconnection. We've never been more connected globally in some ways, and yet we are very separated from the consequences of our economic habits. Marketing executives definitely have the resources, the wherewithal, the functionality of global currency trading, military-backed international contracts and trade agreements, which are quite secretive, and multi-billion-dollar advertising budgets to effectively keep those who produce things and the processes by which they produce hidden from those who consume them. And actually, this is an important task at the multinational level of business, because if we really knew a lot of what was going on behind the scenes, we would really revolt at it. Now, the war on our move towards a moneyless society might actually be aided by the very forces of the monetary system itself. There's a move towards the cashless society, which you can see on your phone, where you have the option of paying for things by apps and by cards, and conspiracy theorists were afraid that we'd have implants with our financial value stored on microchips on our bodies, which hasn't happened, although I think people have volunteered to have these things implanted. In Sweden right now, there's a negative interest rate on the National Bank, which means that if you have money there, you pay to keep it there. They don't pay you interest. It's negative interest. This concept has been used in a more beneficial way with an alternative currency that helps keep local money moving, which I'll talk about later. But in this case, it's private bankers who are skimming. In Sweden, for instance, it's quite hard to pay by cash these days. I've read, although I haven't been to Sweden in many years, there are many signs in businesses saying we don't accept cash. So you need your app or your card, you need something else. And what could be the implications of this? If another run on banks happened, if another financial collapse happened, would people actually be able to? How much resiliency do we have? Would we actually be able to take cash out and use it and survive that way? Should we think about building more resilient forms of transactions and exchange? One economist, Martin Armstrong, suggests that the cashless society goal is to use total totalitarian control over the money supply. Savings could be taxed away by banks. The threat of bank runs could be eliminated. The too big to fail banks can be assured that ample deposits will always be there when they need to confiscate them. Well, here are two historic figures that really had a lot to say about this. And in fact, the one on the right, Silvio Gesell, who founded the Fry economy movement, he was a theoretical economist, social activist. George is the fellow on the left. I'll talk about him a little bit later. He was a communal vegetarian. He lived on vegetarian communes in Germany and Argentina 100 years ago. And I'd love to know what that was like. I haven't really found many details about it. He was a businessman interested in resiliency, in actually, in a way, subverting central bank control over economic action. And his invention, free money, was actually a system of demurrage. Demurrage is the idea is that you have a currency, it might be a paper currency, and it has a form of negative interest on it, whereby periodically, if you hold on to this money, it loses its value. Every once in a while you have to put a stamp on it, which is a form of tax. However, the tax goes towards supporting the local economy through public works projects. It's not siphoned off by any private individual. It's actually a way of keeping the currency moving so that things can still function, so that exchanges can still happen. And some writers theorize that World War II may have been prevented if this had been allowed to continue in Germany and Austria. The central banks outlawed it, at some point, and it led to an extremely economically devastating situation. And a lot of blame was placed on bankers. And bankers, it was the perfect foil for the Nazi scheme because bankers were often considered Jewish. Jewish and banking sort of went together. And it would be very interesting to know if this alternative currency had spread and if it had been allowed to continue, whether World War II would have happened at all. So the figure on the left, his name is George, and he's the founder of Georgism, although I guess we didn't know that till long after his time. He was an American journalist, philosopher, political economist, and one of his most important contributions was the idea of a land value tax, so that owners of land would basically be supporting those who worked land, who actually had no ownership of such things. The idea was that ordinary people who much lower income people would be funded by the rich from taxing their ownership, their assets. He wanted to restrict the use of patents and intellectual property, to have governments own and manage natural monopolies such as utilities and transportation, to dramatically reduce the size of military, to replace contract patronage with direct employment of government workers, to build mass free transportation of public libraries, extend suffrage to women. This is all mid-19th century stuff. It's quite ahead of its time. Winston Churchill took several inspirations from him, and Silvio Gesell, with his Fry economy, was very interested in his writing as well. Another historical figure of great interest was one of the first anarchist philosophers, Pierre Proudhon. This is a beautiful portrait of him by Gustave Courbet from 1840. And he is famous for the statement, "Property is theft." The name of a work he wrote. He criticizes the rights of owners to use and abuse their property as they wish. And he called limited ownership of resources and goods that are in continuous use, such as the tools that we need, the immediate, local, small-scale items that are personal property as opposed to private property. So personal property are the tools that we need and the possessions that we consider valuable, but not necessarily our assets as kind of larger order items. He also said that property is liberty, and he was against the idea of state interference with personal and cooperative endeavors. His rhetoric included this idea of equating slavery with murder, and he knows that if he said, "What is slavery?" and answered, "It is murder," my meaning would at once be understood. No extended argument would be required. But when he comes to say, "What is property?" Could he not also say that it's robbery without being misunderstood? But it's not as clear. It's not as clear because our understanding of property and our treatment of animals as property is very problematic in this regard. So here's somebody with something to say, direct action. So one interesting character I came across on the subject of living without money is an Irishman named Mark Boyle, who lived for 3 years without any money at all, and wrote a book about his experiences, what's necessary to actually make that happen. And he realized at some point that no one is self-sufficient, and self-sufficiency really is a misnomer. We're interdependent, we're dependent on communities. He argues that it's actually far better to be dependent on your local community and people you know than somebody at the other end of the world who's producing your gizmo under conditions that you really have no idea about. Mark Boyle likens this idea of free access and the gift economy to the apple tree giving its fruit freely. Apple trees don't charge for their fruit. He says that we're the only species of millions on the planet that's deluded enough to think that it needs money to eat. He's in disbelief when he sees people walking straight by free food on their way to buy it. And I had a personal experience of that near my place this summer, where a beautiful apple tree with beautiful apples. They weren't worm eaten, and they weren't the kind of apples you think of as being wild apples. We're just untouched on this fruit tree, and people would walk by it all the time. Squirrels would eat the fruit, and I did mention this to one of the residents in that building, that these are beautiful looking apples. Is somebody going to harvest them? One day I walked by and they were all gone. Somebody did harvest them. Glad of that. So a friend of Emma Goldman's, who we don't really know much of today, not as well known, her name was Voltairine de Clare, and yes, her first name came from Voltaire. I don't know how Voltairine, must be a unique name. I can't think of any other Voltairines. And she's very famous for her essay called Direct Action. we know of direct action as a strategy for activism. She wrote about the conditions of striking workers cornered by powerful management 100 years ago. She wrote this about this situation. This is the awful alternative that workers are facing, and this is what makes the most kindly disposed human beings, people who would go out of their way to help a wounded dog or bring home a stray kitten and nurse it or step aside to avoid walking on a worm, resort to violence against their fellow men. Such were the difficulties of employment as workers in America, and still is. She wrote in 1893 about nihilists, and nihilists were another word for anarchists. The etymology of that word is interesting. It's the idea that one would reject the ideologies of previous generations if they didn't have a consistent and useful meaning. So very iconoclastic. She wrote about an encounter with a Russian nihilist. Now, nihilists were also known to throw bombs, and the second Tsar, Alexander, was assassinated by a so-called nihilist or an anarchist. And anarchists were also known in the 19th century as libertarians. So what is meant by these terms? It has so much to do with the time and the place. I quote briefly from this story. Some nihilists I have known in 1893. Imagine a small, lithe figure, sinuous as a serpent, a pointed face lighted with tremendous lights of fire and sunset, and running water gleams in the depth of eyes, now somber, now glowing under heavy brows. Long, loose curling hair falling to the shoulders, a picturesque dress of white embroidered blouse, dark pantaloons and silken sash, and a voice quick and vibrant as the motion of a cobra's tongue. We entered into a conversation concerning a total vegetarian diet, and to my astonishment, this singular being declared that for 8 years he had eaten nothing but raw food, vegetables and fruit. For the last 2 years, fruit alone. He had been living near to nature indeed. In the summer he slept upon the ground, in the winter on a blanket on the floor, and had done so for 17 years. On questioning what had led him to so strange a life, he answered, "Because I want to be free. I saw that men were slaves of their own artificial needs, out of which have grown so many oppressive laws, systems of production, and so forth. I did not wish for anyone else, nor to slave 9 hours or 10 hours a day to gratify a need which is only imaginary." So mutual aid is an anarchist concept based on Peter Kropotkin's theories, the idea that groups can help each other at a local level as a counter-model to the concept of an autonomous individual. In other words, we're not self-sufficient, we're codependent in a positive way. Voluntary associations. Some of the Spanish anarchist villages around the time of the Spanish Civil War were functioning on what almost is a gift economy idea. People would do their labor, it's quite low tech, and people would take what they needed to live. There was an idea of general kind of modesty of life. I mean, obviously these were the proletariat, the working class, and they were able to do this in isolated scenarios until the fascists stomped them out. Basically, this photograph is from a Life magazine spread on a village around that time. You can see that animals play a large role in actually making things happen. This is an interesting little structure called a black house. It's a British structure made of local traditional materials, very low tech, and it was a human and animal dwelling. So people live together with their animals, and it doesn't look as though it would be much comfort in the winter, but it's a beautiful work of art, as it were. This brings to mind the idea of the enclosure movement, where commons lands in Britain were slowly eroded by ownership and rights that had been bought. Frequently there were large areas where animals could be grazed and people could pick and cultivate land, so that there was a subsistence economy. During the 17th and 18th centuries, this largely was destroyed. It was largely privatized, and it was considered key to the agricultural revolution and to the industrial revolution, because new methods were introduced agriculturally on privately owned land, and suddenly you had a dispossessed landless class that was now labor, or even surplus labor. So you had people who needed a livelihood, and they needed to be employed by these privately owned enterprises, which became, of course, the labor movement was born. Shortly after the Industrial Revolution, it was always a case of injustice being fought from below. And the other issue with losing the commons was that people lost traditional skills to subsist. And Mark Boyle talks about this in his year of living moneylessly, that he had to rediscover some basic skills of survival, even though he had an agreeable plot of land with people who were still involved in money, finding herbs to wash his clothes and keep him healthy. A lot of work, not convenient. There were no conveniences here. So the tragedy of the commons, and there was actually a paper written on it from 1833, and it was a paper written by an economist named William Lloyd. The idea being that a common parcel of land would be overused by people and destroyed. Of course, by 1833, the commons had been reduced to almost nothing. So, of course, any leftover commons were going to be in great demand, and indeed, you can see that it was no longer feasible. Now, the tragedy of the anti-commons is the reverse, where, for instance, you had robber barons on the Rhine River in medieval times who would string chains across the river to prevent people from accessing the river. They'd have to stop and pay a toll. And there'd be chains with every estate, with every landed estate, there'd be chains. So the idea of traversing this river became a very expensive and, for some people, impossible thing. So that's the opposite of the tragedy of the commons, the anti-commons. Here's Mark Boyle with his rocket stove and his herbs. He believes that it's a fundamental human right to live without money, if that is their belief, stated under Article 9, Freedom of Thought, Conscience, and Religion of the European Convention of Human Rights. So he's campaigning with a community that he has helped form called Freeganism Community for the right to live moneyless, allowing people to choose to pay their taxes and national insurance contributions through tithe or labor, or whatever legal alternative tender the government might offer. He's written 3 books. He actually cooperated with a friend to make a website, a friend actually who was doing animal rescue, and the animal rescue and the website would take care of his costs that way. He began his year of living moneylessly with a huge vegan feast in Bristol, which became a huge community event, and everybody donated food and time, and he described the whole experience as frightening before it started, but completely intoxicating and fulfilling once it had been set in motion, and he realized that this was a joyful thing that people were really enjoying. He went beyond his year. He actually, I think, did close to 3 years before writing the Moneyless Manifesto, another book, which I'll discuss a little bit, and a further book on activism called Drinking Molotov Cocktails with Gandhi, full of interesting ideas. So the Moneyless Manifesto has an interesting concept called progression of principles, and it's a model that could be useful for somebody who wants to live closer to their ideals, moneyless or part of an intentional community, or a part of a transition movement. It's kind of inspired by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'll show later. He describes as maybe 6 levels of transportation, if you want to think about transportation as one of your aspects of your life where you have to make decisions. This is the kind of thing that you could make your own model here with your own levels, deciding how you want to prioritize your ethical priorities with regard to life. So he talks about level 1 as possibly being walking barefoot, connecting with the earth beneath your feet. So that's the ideal, the 100% local gift economy, walking barefoot. Level 2, he would say, might be walking in shoes he made himself or were gifted to him from locals, from local materials. Level 3 might be walking in shoes that he bartered for, which were made locally. Level 4 might be walking in trainers made in a Chinese factory. Level 5 might be cycling on an industrial scale bicycle. Level 6 might be driving a hybrid car. It gives another scale, where level 1 is complete co-sufficiency on a gift economy basis. Level 2 is co-sufficiency with some currency and barter mixed in a fully localized economy. Level 3, he calls gift economies existing with minimal dependence on dominant economic model, in other words, the monetary system. Level 4, he would call local exchange trading systems, which were invented actually in British Columbia in the 1980s. Time banks, local currencies existing with minimal dependency on the dominant model. Level 5 might be a greener globalized monetary economy, and level 6, the globalized monetary economy. So the lower on the scale you can strive for. It's also a matter of when can you do this in your life? Do you have time to do this in your life? Just how you're structuring your life. In one of the points he makes in drinking Molotov cocktails with Gandhi, there is definitely an assault on the natural environment, as we can see. I mean, the ecosystems are under assault, and our response to that, we want to consider ourselves nonviolent as animal activists and vegans. However, he writes about how social movements tend to have nonviolence at the forefront and all kinds of other techniques in the background. He likens the earth to Gaia and likens our bodies to the earth, where we're full of antibodies that violently attack antigens that pose a serious threat to our health, viruses and bacteria. And he likens activists to the antibodies of Gaia, who use all kinds of methods of fighting against what he calls the machine, the global financial system. So that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As you can see, you can't really get to the top without having a foundation. In the cycle of poverty, if people are stuck in the cycle of poverty, they're never going to have a chance to get to the level of creativity and problem solving beyond the most basic survival levels. At the bottom we have our basic physiological functions, our sense of safety. Next, employment is part of that if we need money to survive. Our health, beyond that, friendship, family, intimacy, and then self-esteem, in other words, achievement, which might be sometimes mistaken as prestige, and the aberrations that go with that in a monetary system where people try to outdo each other. And then beyond that, more altruistic, creative endeavors. So that could be an inspiration for your progress of principles, POP, that scale I mentioned earlier. So Freeganism, a huge area of getting around our situation in a capitalist economy, where all kinds of worker abuse, animal exploitation, hunger, ecological destruction, mass incarceration, war, inequitable distribution of resources, commodification of women, all kinds of issues that are addressed by Freegans, who are often anarchists, I discovered, and place a strong emphasis on local, ecologically sustainable practices. This is an example of a free box in Berlin, and it's free stuff that gets put in a centralized place. There are actually free stores where you simply donate things, drop them off, pick them up, no money's exchanged. Why Freegan was a pamphlet written in 1999 by a drummer named Warren Oakes, and he talked about Freeganism as an anti-consumeristic ethic about eating, and describes practices including dumpster diving, plate scraping, wild foraging, gardening, theft, employee scams, and barter as alternatives to paying for food. And the motivations may be numerous. They may be ideological. I mean, if you're an anarchist or anti-capitalist, environmental. There are religious reasons, possibly. He goes also into detail about conserving water, pre-cycling. Pre-cycling is the idea of avoiding bringing products into your life that create waste, packaging. So Freegans, I mean, the idea of combining vegan plus free, we assume that veganism is part of this movement. It was largely inspired by a sociologist named Marcel Mauss. Many of the values here were studied by Marcel Mauss in gift exchange economies, in foraging and hunter-gathering societies around the world. And he studied, for instance, the potlatch. In his book called The Gift, he used the term potlatch to refer to a whole set of exchange practices in tribal societies, on the West Coast mainly, with political, religious, kinship, and economic implications. So it's a ceremonial and it's a festivity with music and conviviality. And the gift givers themselves tend to be aristocratic, and they want to outdo their competitors so as to capture important kinship and religious roles by giving more. In other words, by sharing more. And this was outlawed by the Canadian government. However, they found it impossible to enforce, and it became a summary offense at some point, and then it was decriminalized, and it has experienced a resurgence. It's not strictly a vegan thing, but it's definitely an outgrowth of the subsistence economy. There's a quote I want to read from a chief. Oaxalagalis of the Quagold tribe describes the potlatch to a famous anthropologist named Franz Boas, and he said, "We'll dance when our laws command us to dance. We'll feast when our hearts desire to feast. Do we ask the white man, do as the Indian does? No, we do not. Why then will you ask us, do as the white man does? It's a strict law that bids us to dance. It's a strict law that bids us to distribute our property among our friends and neighbors. It's a good law. Let the white man observe his law, we shall observe ours. And now, if you are to come to forbid us to dance, be gone. If not, we will welcome you to us." And it actually brings to mind Emma Goldman's anarchist statement, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. Totally unrelated, but it's a little thought I had. So Freegans, it may be less ceremonial, maybe less traditional, but Freegans do sincerely want to share the good things that get thrown out and adopt a cruelty-free lifestyle. Abstain from eating and wearing and using animal skins if they're true Freegans, to remove themselves from participation in the capitalist economy as far as possible. So living in a community of like-minded people is a helpful thing. As with veganism, of course, it's an ideal, and it may be impossible to achieve at all times because we just don't have enough control over, unless we're actually living Mark Boyle's moneyless life, we're making a range of decisions all the time about what we're willing to say yes to. Sometimes squatting is part of the Freegan life, where abandoned buildings are inhabited by people. So here's a great poster girl for the Freegan movement pulling usable food out of the trash. The danger, of course, well, there are multiple dangers. If meat gets mixed in, the pathogens could be very dangerous. There may be broken glass in there. Some companies go to the extent of bleaching or otherwise making their waste unusable. And there's the social stigma of getting down and dirty, garbage picking. There's an interesting article in Critical Animal Studies about raccoons and Freegans, and how they disrupt socially sanctioned food pathways. They don't purchase their food, they don't drop it in the appropriate levels. Now, there is a good practice for Freeganism, is that they don't scatter their food around and leave messes. Very often people who are throwing this food away would rather see it being used and would rather people actually take it. And in fact, some waste has been diverted to food share organizations so that it doesn't go to the dumpster at all. Other corporations lock their dumpster, have security around it, and make it impossible for people to access it. So it's a very complicated area.
France, didn't they have a development in this?
France is making moves to divert as much waste as possible to food banks and food sharing organizations.
And they made throwing away food by supermarkets illegal, something like that?
Yeah, to make that kind of food waste legal, yeah. We have a little video which we could watch if there's time called Freegan Love, which talks about how you can, how Freegans can actually get in and salvage restaurant waste and take it home or share it. So Megans, of course, a subset of Freegans. Megans would only consume animal products that would otherwise be wasted, sometimes roadkill, and they're arguing that even benign vegan products under capitalism may not be actually very virtuous, depending on how they're produced. But throwing animal carcasses into dumpsters is very, very wasteful and disrespectful of animals, and they would rather honor the animal that way, although they would never support the food production of animals. And of course, vegans would be repulsed by it. It's a pretty hardcore kind of Freegan. It's certainly not for everybody.
So is the norm for Freegan vegan?
Well, it's because there's so much anarchy really in the movement, and that there's no strict definition of Freegan, although the fact that it's part of the term itself. But then you see vegetarians are not necessarily vegetable eaters. They may eat animal products. So that's why the word vegan had to be invented. The beginning and end of vegetarian is vegan. But I would say that from my readings that veganism was a quite important part of Freeganism, and that many Freegans are vegan. I couldn't give you a figure on that. So I was very disappointed to learn from you, Paul, that Food Not Bombs locally was supporting the Short Hills deer hunt. However, it's a volunteer global movement, and they share vegan meals as a protest to war and poverty. Locally, in Canada, there was a situation, I believe it was in Kitchener, where local businesses were trying to stop them because it was an anti-capitalist, anti-military demonstration. The local business people didn't like it. So it's direct action, it's in your face. And Paul, you told me about this guy, the monk named Rainflower Hut. This is another example of one person who, through donating his resources, his life savings the year before he died, to the idea of free food for people in China, for the elders especially, with no money involved and totally on a volunteer basis. And now Rainflower Hut, there are 300 of them approximately in China. It's continually growing. It promotes a vegetarian diet, a healthy low-carbon lifestyle, volunteerism and service, practice of traditional values, cultivation of virtues. And it gets around the government communist control by using a Confucian decor, officially government-approved Confucian texts. So gratitude to the country is included. It seems almost like a tea ceremony with food. The elders are served first. It'd be a very interesting place to visit. No money is involved. although I suppose that at some level there are spaces that have to be maintained. It's by donation, so I would say that it's part of the monetary system, definitely, but it tries to take money out of the equation for its patrons.
It sounds like the people who enable it to happen monetarily do so in order to gain merit, like spiritual merit, similar to giving alms in Buddhism.
So a similar elder care system exists in Japan called Furye Kippu, and it's non-monetary, but it's caring relationship tokens. It's a currency created in 1995 to help people take care of elders without the use of money, but it is an exchange. So an hour of service helping an elder, usually involving cooking and gardening and cleaning. Those are often occupations that are helped with. These credits, they could help a local person, and if they have a relative on the other side of Japan, they can use their credits so that somebody else can help those. It kind of reflects the dislocation of families. They're not living together anymore, but it's a kind of nice personal way to care for them. And apparently elders who participate in this would much rather do it with the Furye Kippu system than with the monetary system. They have more trust in the people that are involved. They end up making friendships that way. So another local currency, the Bristol Pound, is directed similar to Silvio Gesell's system of keeping the money local so that you know exactly where your money is going and what it's being used for. Toronto actually had its own dollar, the Toronto dollar, from 1998 to 2012. And 10% of the funds, similar to demurrage, it was kind of a tax, were used for assisting low-income people, the unemployed and the homeless. And apparently in the first 10 years they raised $110,000. Not a lot of money when you think of the size of Toronto, but it was a project that was started by a pastor in Willowdale. As of 2013, it apparently doesn't function any longer due to lack of support. So the Zeitgeist movement is a global movement advocating for a non-monetary economy. It's a very technical, heavy-duty issue, and it's full of great ideas, and none of which can be just explained in sound bites. And so I'm not going to go into detail about it, except to say that it's maybe 500,000 members around the world, chapters, meetings. It's mainly social advocacy education. There's an annual event where lectures are given and food is shared, and there's a strong vegan presence here. Veganism is not a prerequisite to membership in the group, and there have been conflicts, apparently, of aggressive vegans who are forbidding membership to non-vegans, and it became an issue. Actually, this event happened 5 years ago in Allen Gardens, very close to where I live, and that's Ryan Diamond, who went on to found the Toronto Tool Library, and he's inviting people to come and get free food. It's all organic vegetables that were donated by a farmer. It was kind of a community garden project, and members of the movement over the period of the summer grew this food. It was beautiful food. I took some home. Local, seasonal food. Several thousand pounds of this were given away, and it was a lovely community event where people came and took food and took a flyer, and it was good for bringing awareness to the movement, and people could go online and read more about it. People's Kitchen, another idea of sharing locally found food. It's a German initiative called Volksküche, or Volksküche, a free supper club. The really, really free market. It's all over the world. It happens in Toronto. You can take things away, you can bring them. Free services, no money exchanged. You can get haircuts, legal advice. No barter, no trade, everything's free. True gift economy action. Usually happens in a park in the West End. This strange and rather questionable animal experiment. Could ravens cooperate for food? And Dr. Jörg Maassen of University of Vienna was using these ravens in an artificial environment to see if they would cooperate. So he had a little platform with 2 strings threaded through a loop, and cheese, not vegan food, was on the platform. The ravens would have to cooperate if they wanted to get the food. And he discovered that they often could cooperate and pull these threads simultaneously, they get the food. One unexpected part was that he found that there were cheaters. If they worked fast enough, once the food was close to them, they would snatch both pieces of food. And this researcher found that once the offender had cheated, they would not be trusted again. In a similar environment, cooperation would not happen. Now, this has been shown to happen with humans and chimpanzees, but it's a novelty among birds. I mean, these are not birds being observed in their natural environment. These are birds that have manipulated into this scenario. And it makes me wonder, the artificiality of our whole social construct, our social contract, does it make us behave in ways like this? Does it encourage behaviors that are not cooperative simply because we have this incentive of money and the possibility of actually accumulating vast amounts of it, or at least taking money that would otherwise help somebody else?
there's something that struck me with the experiment. First of all, it's been assumed by biologists for a long time that animals are competitive, whereas now we know the new evidence is that there's also cooperation. So you don't have to simulate cooperation, in fact it occurs. But the interesting thing, according to game theory, is that cheating doesn't tend to be the best move if you're dealing with the same person over and over again.
Right.
and the most optimal play in game theory is cooperation when there's multiple plays. Mm-hmm. Getting to humans, up until really recently in our long-term history, we never had to deal with more than, say, 500 of us at a time, and it would be a community, a tribe. Even in medieval villages. It's only in modernity, when the massive increase in populations and the rise in anonymity, that you have a situation where you can avoid meeting the same person even while living in the same city, and thus that encourages cheating and non-cooperative behavior. So really, for Freeganism, veganism, etc. to work optimally would mean that we would have to reduce our numbers back to the point where we live more tribally, and thus we're ensure greater cooperation.
That's one of Mark Boyle's major points, is that the free economy is a very local idea, and that localism is where the community is, and where the communication is, and where the possibilities are, really. Especially when you look at corporate globalism, which is willing to break any rule it can break in the monetization of life, really. Now, if things are going the way they're going, and we have a major social breakdown, we're going to have a breakdown of technology, and it's going to force us to go back to rediscover skills that we may not even know that we were missing, in order to survive. And we may not have our devices. We probably won't. I mean, we can't even get them to work when they're supposed to work.
Well, that's what I was thinking, is that actually this whole ethic is not just sort of, just a fringe movement. No. It's actually the future.
It's the future. It's the future,
It's the future, not because we want it to be the future, as much as the fact that it has to be the future because there is no other future, because the technological industrial society can't possibly last. It's not unsustainable, means it won't last. Yeah. So we have to resort to these lifeboat communities, or the last man standing scenario, which is survivalism, the absolute opposite of altruism and cooperation. So we have, Heinberg says we have the choice between the last man standing scenario and the lifeboat communities. Yeah. And so Freeganism seems to be a move, and veganism, in the direction of the lifeboat community.
Definitely. I mean, the cooperation necessary to make it work now under all the adverse circumstances. Although you do find, I actually lived with some squatters and Freegans. At least I hung out at a place where the tenancy was in limbo and people were dumpster diving, and there is an excitement and a kind of infectiousness about sharing your recovered gains. It's a countercultural thing. It's definitely going very much against the mainstream. And you see punk sensibilities and people who are disenfranchised from the mainstream, but increasingly people who just can't find regular work. And in fact, some of these people in the Freegan videos are considered kind of a social activism life, where they travel around and they live a Freegan life and they spread the word and they share their food, and that's their activism. The Zeitgeist, the technological fix, I didn't get much into that because it's so complex, and it does assume somehow that we're going to make a smooth transition, or at least some kind of transition to a non-monetary economy, where we still have access to all kinds of high-tech things, and in fact it might actually be a golden age where without intellectual property rights and all kinds of obstructions that money creates, that the free flow of sharing of information and skills and technology could really be a huge boost for humanity. But looking at the way things are going, it's just very hard to see that happen. I think some people are just more optimistic that it might happen. And it seems like the wiser approach, if you're thinking ahead, is hope for the best and plan for the worst.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to think outside of the technological money box that we're in, because we've been in it for so long, and yet we know that it can't last. So we have to think about other ways of doing things. And then there's the biggest problem seems to be other people. That it's such a violent world, and that there are so many people that would, even if we wanted to change things for the better, there's going to be people that are going to be standing in the way of it. So it does seem almost to require a kind of a revolutionary ethos to deal with it, whether violent or non-violent. Preferably non-violent. Right? Like, I think there's more power in the non-violent movement, but I feel myself being kind of in a marginal economic position. Sessional instructors at U of T don't make hardly anything. That I have nothing to lose by being 100% Freegan, and much to gain, in fact.
Yeah, I think there probably are local groups that will do a tour of the good sites for dumpsters. It's often done as a video. You can go on YouTube and find out where the good places are, and go and harvest the waste.
There's a sort of a, in terms of the ranking, like there's a sort of a number 2 or 3 option that Ian does. He goes to Chinatown and looks for the deals. And those are practically going to go in the garbage anyway, and you get them for like, what, a third of the price or something?
Yeah.
So that's kind of like almost there, that's like, you're halfway there.
Well, local merchants are far more likely to salvage the usable vegetables. I mean, corporate packaging precludes the idea of sorting through spoiled things. If only one spoiled fruit ruins the bag, the whole bag gets thrown out. They're not going to open the bag and sort through them, whereas, a local grocer might do that. And it's just a much more conservative approach.
And just right here also, at U of T, every year, the students who are leaving in April, they throw away vast amounts of usable and often new things, like clothing, electronics. There was this priest I knew who was an environmentalist who would go and dumpster dive every April and retrieve large amounts of things that were quite good and then give them away.
And those are the same things that the arriving students are going to need the following year.
Some students in the States have turned that into a business.
Okay.
Yeah, they grab it all and they sell it back to the incoming students.
Yeah, I mean, if the university was really forward-thinking, they could have a large room, a storage room where this stuff could be donated and people could come and take it when they needed it for the following year.
Well, they do take the furniture that is used and they sell it at a very low cost back to the public. But in a lot of cases, they even give it away. They leave it outside their furniture room, and you can just pick it up, like chairs, desks, file cabinets. U of T is a great place for practicing this Freeganism thing.
Yeah, excellent.
You can go to conferences after they've just left, and they'll have apples, sandwiches. They throw it all away normally.
Yeah.
Like, it's unbelievable, the food waste here. Yeah.
There is a couple of examples where I think technology helps the mindset of Freeganism. For instance, the free cycle. Have you heard of
Oh yes,
free cycle?
remember free cycle, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, one can go there and just pick up whatever. As I'll give them for free, you just show up and you have one. So that's and also the Toronto Library. Like there's so much you can get for free. Like borrowing books and movies and DVDs and all sorts of things. You can even learn online now through lynda.com. They're actually offering a free subscription to that. You can teach yourself lots of skills through free learning, right? So that's what I think. There's not everything technology is negative or
not at all.
against the idea of a free vegan living.
Yeah, no, I would definitely not say that technology is negative, not by any stretch. I mean, there are many positive things. Lifelong learning has never been easier with the internet. I mean, you can study to your heart's content, learn about whatever you want to learn about. However, as we know, it's a little bit fragile, and the resilience factor is to be determined. As time goes by, and as Tushar Mehta was saying, there are all kinds of ethical questions that we have to ask about using this technology, because the supply chain is extremely murky and continues to be.
Well, the solution there is not to get rid of things like that entirely, but rather to recycle them. And so I knew a fellow in North York who would take old computers, revive them, and then give them to schools or whoever needed them. It was the whole idea of Buy Nothing Day. Recycle. There's practically everything that we use can be recycled. Wood, minerals, electronics, clothing, everything.
Well, if things do collapse, we probably will be rummaging through huge resource piles of garbage and trying to make sense of the waste and reuse it.
Well, there'll be people living on garbage dumps as they do in India.
As they do now. one of the Zeitgeist ideas, if we didn't have cyclical consumption, if we didn't have to buy a new computer every 3 years because of upgrades to the system and whatnot, if things were built in a modular way so that parts of them could be upgraded and replaced and were built to better quality, so that we had a technical efficiency rather than a market efficiency, then the objects themselves would last indefinitely, and we wouldn't be throwing things away like electronics and things that potentially could last for generations. You know, if you look at the earliest light bulbs, some of them are still working apparently. You know, things were built to last at some point.
You know, I could see where you could get into a second lecture on this. The model that the liminal animals provide, the raccoons, and the whole concept of merging this idea with zoopolis. The ideal of the urban, transformed, sustainable urban environment that's animal friendly.
I wanted to mention this book, which was very inspiring. I was sick last week, and I was holed up in bed reading Evasion, which is last week. It's a great little tome on surviving as an urban freegan, and it goes through every possible scam that you can get away with. The idea is to live off the fat of the corporate beast in any way that you can, legally or otherwise. Very entertaining writing, and apparently this author, who's semi-anonymous, I think he goes by the name of Mac, has written a couple of other books, but very, very readable. Evasion, and it's from Crime Think Letters.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. Speaking of Freeganism, I noticed that Ian has peeled or cut some fruit over there. So maybe somebody wants to partake.